Let's move for an approval of the minutes, the August minutes.
I make a motion to approve the August minutes from, for the Planning Commission.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
One, and I'll abstain.
And I'll abstain.
And Kyle's abstaining.
I wasn't here.
Okay, appearance of interested citizens. We have 2 citizens here tonight. Mrs. Dorfler? Okay, all righty. Discussion, results of the buildable lands inventory and housing needs analysis. Staff?
Okay. Well, you know, we've been talking about the buildable lands inventory housing needs analysis for some time. We have the completed report. That was money that was provided by the state because we were declared a rent-burdened city. So the funds were provided. We hired Echo Northwest to do the study. This is what Echo Northwest does, and they are they're accepted in the state as basically the people that really know their stuff when it comes to doing these studies. So we have a lot of faith in the study. We know that they did it according to best practices. They did it with their full weight and knowledge and experience to bring to bear the study and the analysis as it was then done. Now they have done the analysis, and this is going to come to a shock to everybody in the room, but we have deficits in our housing supply.
First time here.
Yeah, I knew it. I'm sorry, I should have let you down easy. No, I think everybody intuitively, if not more specifically, knew that there is a deficit in all of our housing supply. But that is just only in the Keizer portion of the UGB is there a deficit of our housing supply. So what that leaves us with is that we cannot adopt the report, we can accept the report, and we can come up with a plan to address those deficits. So the analysis includes specific policies and action items that the city can undertake and can address. What we are going to do is come to council and basically have this talk with council. As you know, this is an extremely important, at this juncture in the city's future, this is an important decision point as to what we're going to do to address our housing supply. So tonight what we had hoped to do is basically we'll just present to you the summary of the technical analysis, the number of acres and units that we are in deficit. We are simply taking those as a given. I can tell you that the methodology that was used was very thorough, even down to a lot by lot examination of what the potential development capacity is. This was done in conjunction with the material and the information that the Council of Governments maintains on building permit activity, et cetera. So we have a lot of faith in the technical analysis. That is really not really subject to debate unless you decide that you have some magic wizard that nobody knows about. The real task before us is to look at those policies and actions and to make sure that they pass your test as far as do they feel like they are something that we should pursue and engage in. Even if you have questions, this would be the time that we would ask you to say, you know, I'm really not sure about it. So with that, unless there's any questions about the general background of how we got to this point, have asked Shane if he could walk us through the key points of the report.
If I could clarify one piece on the letter from you, Shane, from August 7th, the one that was in our packet. It mentions that the Housing Needs Analysis Committee voted to move forward with solving our problem within our urban growth boundary. It doesn't clarify whether that's within the Salem-Keizer UBG or whether it's within the Keizer UBG. So could you clarify that for me?
Well, actually, I forgot one piece, and then Shane can take it away.
Okay.
Sorry. The first action item that we are going to come to is basically just that.
Oh, well,
Question.
Skipping ahead then, okay.
No, you're not. You're actually going to the first point. What I am asking is that we consider that item as last on the action items, that we skip to action item number 2 and come back to that after we have looked at all the other policies.
Sure.
If that's okay with the commission.
As long as we get to it.
He basically wants to save the best for last.
I get it. We're all
And honestly, Jeffrey, to answer your question, it would be looking at being able to accommodate growth within the existing UGB. So
Salem-Keizer combined.
Okay.
Yeah, just the UGB as it is with basically no amendment to it. So that being said, Nate, it's a long introduction, Nate. So the bottom line is, yeah, there's a deficit of land. We all knew this. Our comp plan has had an identified deficit for the past however many years, 10 years. The deficit got bigger when we restudied it. A couple of things I would point out, and Nate is right, Bob Parker with ECHO is like the guru of housing needs analysis, and everybody's like, oh, Bob did it? Yeah, it's all right. And honestly, he knows his stuff. But every housing needs analysis does have to operate from a set of assumptions. And so the assumptions that were used in developing our housing needs analysis did look at our current underlying zonings, what our lot size standards are and things like that. So the one thing I wanted to make sure that we were kind of clear with you folks, because we've had all of these planning projects going on all at once. Some of the stuff we've been talking about with efficiency measures and the revitalization plan, the assumptions used for our housing needs analysis really weren't looking at some of those new concepts that have also been kind of on this similar track. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. But bottom line is we had to look at what is the population growth in the next 20 years in Keizer. We had to kind of extrapolate that number out from an assumption based on an overall population split. And then they built a land base based on what's developable, what's constrained, what's oversized, tax values. There was a bunch of math that they did, and math is hard, especially for planners. So we let consultants do our math for us. But in the end analysis, we need 479 gross acres of residential land types. Yes.
Sorry, forgot something. Well, you said it, and so I have to make sure that we understand about that assumed split. That assumed split comes when we did the regional when we did the regional housing, buildable lands inventory housing needs analysis. That was done in 2012. And at that time, basically, that's when it was assumed that we went back and looked at our historic amount of population that was in Keizer versus that amount that was in Salem. And that magic number was 15.6 was in Keizer and 84.4 in Salem. We used that number because that was the best number that we had available, given all of the other changes that have happened with PSU's population split. They, in their wisdom, chose not to give a separate number for Keizer and Salem. We don't have anything better to go on than that assumed split. Now, that is a huge assumption. We are simply saying that that was based on historic records, and that was what we had agreed upon back in 2012. That does not mean that that is going to hold in the future. This is not like we can decide we're going to get a UGB split and we're going to use 15.6% of the total number, et cetera, et cetera. That would never hold up in that kind of analysis. But it is what we have, and that's what was used, and that was what this entire thing is based on. So that, you just need to know that and file that away in the background so that this whole thing is developed based on that assumption. Sorry, I thought that was important that you understand that. Okay, you can go on now.
Okay. So, and the other thing I'll kind of, little segue, and I really appreciated Mr. Parker and their team with Echo. And, he started our very first meeting. I know some of y'all were there, the very first kind of kickoff meeting with the advisory committee. And the one thing that Bob said, as he said, the thing about population projections and housing needs analysis and buildable land inventory is there's a lot of math involved, there's a lot of analysis involved, but there's only one thing that holds true for every single one that he's ever done, and that's that they always are wrong. So there is obviously, you can't project it down to perfect. And so I think with what Nate is saying, and we'll get to it in the strategies, one of the elements that's pointed out is we as Keizer, we are going to get a Keizer specific Portland State produced and DLCD blessed bona fide population number. We think next, not this coming up spring, 2021. So one of the pieces there is that most likely when we get that new hard and fast, truly defensible number specific to us, we're gonna have to revisit some stuff because it's gonna help kind of truth out where we're at. But from what we based this on, which was the current overall UGB population projection number and then split it down, this is what they came up with. So it was the 479 acres. 200 of those acres were kind of designated for low density residential development, 188 acres for the medium density, and 89 acres for more of the high density. Quite a bit of land that's needed, quite a bit of land that's in deficit. And so, it's kind of thick. It's not nearly as thick as the revitalization plan stuff. It's sort of boring, but I think that I would encourage you, spend some time in it, look at those assumptions, because it's not just about strict population and where you can fit people. They do a lot going into the analysis to talk about the different types of housing that's needed for different income brackets. So you're gonna produce a different housing product for a certain demographic, a certain financial place and time, a certain age and size of family. And so the analysis actually goes into that type of a look at our community and some of those trends. And these are the types of lands needed to support those specific types of housing that's needed to serve the actual population growth that's there. So that's not all that the study did, though. And the bigger piece and what we really wanted to come to tonight to bring to you guys, which is more the stuff that's going to drive the policies and maybe the text amendments we bring you in the next year and different things that we're going to be looking to plan for. And that comes in the much skinnier document, which I hope y'all had a chance to kind of at least kind of look over. And that is the kind of the housing strategy is what they call it. And essentially the housing strategy that was created, it comes up with kind of 4 general strategic priorities. The first is land supply and availability, to essentially provide a 20-year supply of land for the long range, but also to provide a short-term supply as well. So it's land that can be served and developed and utilized. The second strategic priority was to encourage a broader mix of housing. There's a discussion in here about middle housing, tiny houses, some different kinds of things, which I think is very relevant for this governing body, because ultimately, if we're going to encourage a broader mix, the way we would have to do that would be amendments to our development code. And so that's something that I very much would like to kind of get. And I know it's not a public hearing, and I know there's rules about it's not voting and it's not making decisions, but I'm looking, Nate's looking for a little bit of the kind of the consensus and direction, if you will, on where to send staff off to go on some of those pieces. So that's one of them. The third was identifying strategies to support affordable housing. This study was funded because we are identified as a rent burdened community, and affordable housing is a legitimate issue, and planning for affordable housing is very difficult. We don't have a ton of tools to do that, but that's one of the strategic goals, is to identify some ways that we can do what we can do. And then finally evaluate funding tools to support residential development as a whole. And so for each of those priorities, they kind of broke them down, and they have these action items that go along with it. So if you'll bear with me, what I was hoping we could do tonight is just kind of walk through those action items. And they said we can't do the first one, which is the funnest one. No, it's the biggest question, which is kind of the UGB discussion. We're gonna push that one off. So, but if we start and look at the action items as a whole, that providing land supply, they broke down and said how you could do that, or like this way and this way. The primary one is talk about the UGB stuff. We'll do it later. But the second piece of that they identify is that we should evaluate opportunities to increase allowable residential densities. With the revitalization plan, we're looking at kind of a finite scope of area that we're looking at increasing mildly some densities. That's what the plan kind of proposes to do. That plan will be before City Council for a public hearing Monday. But I think this is more of a big picture look of, should the city be looking to increase some of the allowable densities in the residential zone citywide. Currently we allow 8 units per acre as a kind of a max for low density residential. And so that would be one of the pieces as we look forward in the next year to two. If those are things that you want to see us look into, is either increased densities or possibly reduction in lot sizes or dimensional standards for single family development, that's what we would deem in the kind of the toolbox of what they call efficiency measures, which ultimately we have to kind of look at those regardless, especially when you look at that kind of future, well, what if some sort of amendment to an urban growth boundary was proposed? You would have to implement efficiency measures first. So, I don't know how, do I get to take a poll, like a straw poll, or what?
Well, we'll get there. But so if you were to, for example, reduce the minimum lot size citywide, it still does not change the underlying fact that most of the city is parcelized. Most of the city is already subdivided. We're talking about things where somebody might combine lots, and there are plenty of these heritage lots that are larger in size, and there may be some applicability. But by simply reducing the lot size, that does not mean that we're going to create 25% more lots. The physical constraints of the lot are still there. The access, all of those kinds of things are exactly what they are. And so keep in mind that when we say, how do you feel about reducing the minimum lot size, we're talking in limited case. This isn't going to somebody and say, oh, you've got a half-acre lot. You must divide your ground. This simply says, if you were to divide your ground, you can perhaps use, you may be able to develop it better if you have a couple of smaller lots. There's nothing here suggesting that we set a minimum density. It's simply increasing the density potential. So that in and of itself takes a lot of the pressure off of Well, what am I doing to a property owner? A property owner is still in absolute charge of what the future of their property. So just keep that in mind.
Nate, I have a question. Is there any reason why, at least along main corridors, nodes like we've talked about on the other River Road thing, not having minimum density? Other than the
That is a
political?
huge policy question that the council would have to weigh in on. And by doing that, keep in mind that you automatically then raise the threshold of where somebody is going to enter into that process. In other words, for example, in these higher density areas that we would create, for example, people will think good and long and hard before they have to meet a minimum requirement of so many units. Now, we may get there depending on where we are in the future, but that is just simply not something that the city of Keizer has ever directed in the past.
And I would just add the one thing to clarify this is that in what Nate's talking about, he's specifically talking about single family, kind of your classic single family zone stuff. We do have minimum densities for multifamily already on the books. So in a medium high density comp planned piece of property, it's a minimum of 8 units an acre to 22 units an acre max currently. That's been that way since like the mid 90s. And that is one piece to recognize. And this is where it's hard because I think, and I do the same thing. When I think about a housing needs analysis, and I know Keizer, right now our housing type, which is going to kind of dovetail into strategy 2, which is encouraging a broader mix of housing types. Our housing type is predominantly single family detached, large lot is what, the planning world would call it, even though they're not really a lot of large lots, but large lot development. It's like 70%, 69% generally. And so when you're looking at these targeted densities where you might increase, I think that ultimately the utility from a planner's perspective would probably be more obvious on the multifamily parcels. Remember, with our current set of assumptions and our H&A, we're identifying basically 200 acres of single family low density, 200 acres of more the medium density, a little higher density stuff. So possibly increasing the density allowance wouldn't help so much in the single family that's really parcelized, but maybe on the residential medium density piece that's 2 acres or 3 acres, you might be able to actually expand and create quite a bit more units because ultimately they could utilize more of the site for housing product. So it doesn't add all the land types, but it might help accomplish part of the land type. So I think the big thing from my perspective is, and obviously these strategies were kind of vetted through the advisory committee, and they said, yeah, these are all good ideas, we should move these on forward. And I guess what I'm wanting to kind of find out from you all is, are any of these things kind of in your mind, whoa, hold the phone, this is like a non-starter for me, I have major pause or major concern on these, or are they kind of like, this makes sense, this seems reasonable? Is that explaining it good enough?
Perfect.
Okay. Are you saying something?
I'm just trying to, how do you want to, keep in mind that as we ask you, how do you feel about these policies? It's not going to change that report. It's just simply going to be able to go to council and say, Planning Commission discussed it, and this is this is what they felt about it, and just simply inform the council of what your observations and comments are about it. It will not change the report.
Commissioner Lawyer, do you have a question?
So, hello. So 479 acres is the cumulative total UGB need. Is that what I heard?
Yes.
And so we're looking at approximately 15.6% of that total.
No, that's just Keizer's need. Sorry, Matt, yes, that's the cumulative need that we've identified for just, that's all, that's.
479 is just Keizer.
Yeah, so the percent is confusing. They looked at the UGB, whatever it was, a year and a half, 2 years ago when we got our number, and it applied this big number for the year 2039 or 2038, whatever it was. I think it came out in 2018. So they set a number for Salem, Keizer, UGB. The whole area within UGB said you're going to grow to this big within that box. Well, it's not a box, the blob.
And you're bound.
And
by
that's
that number.
and that's because the legislature changed the way that we do housing needs analysis, yeah, whatever. It's a weird word. They changed that in statute to say thou shalt have to use this Portland State projected number. It used to be that the counties got together and like the last number we did was a county generated number, and there was some, apparently there was some, I don't know what you call it. Yeah, some trading of numbers and maybe some unincorporated other counties across the river that said, yeah, take our number, take our number. We don't want that anyway. So we kind of created our own number previously. So now they've kind of locked it in to say the number for the number of people has to be based on this, and then you can fill that housing product accordingly. So the 479 is all assumed that that's going to only accommodate the growth for Keizer's shared portion of it.
So that number simply gave us our population to work with. And so then from there it got extrapolated to the different housing types that Shane explained, and that equals the 470 whatever number.
Yeah.
So I guess almost a philosophical question that we have as a planning commission is whether or not, is there something in the law that mandates that we have to grow?
Yes.
Okay.
The law says that we must be able to demonstrate that we have a 20-year land supply, period.
And aside from reducing, lot sizes to minimum lot sizes, I mean, you either expand your total footprint of the city in terms of the urban growth boundary, or you have to you are essentially mandated to look at increased density, correct?
Well, the mandate is you have to show how you're meeting that supply. And generally, absolutely, all cities use a combination of approaches. Now, the difference here is Salem and Keizer are the only city in the state of Oregon that share a UGB, outside of the metro, of course.
So I guess if I rephrase my question, it would be either get bigger geographically or put in place these tools that allow for density and other things like that.
Well, and for us, we have other options available to us. So, yeah, the law says you justify how you're meeting your 20-year supply, period. And we have the opportunity to implement land use efficiencies. In our unique case, we have the ability to say, you know what? We have documentation showing that the entire UGB satisfies both cities' growth needs, or a combination of the two. Although we'll talk about that when we get to point number one.
So backwards. It's so confusing. Shannon, do you have something?
Commissioner de Blasi?
I can't remember if it was Nate or you, Shane, who said that when the official Keizer-only number of population growth projection comes out in 2021, there'll be a reevaluation. During that reevaluation, will that include some of these measures, efficiency measures that you said were not part of the underlying presumption?
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of the hope. The other thing is that if some efficiency measures are put into place, and this is where it gets really in the weeds, and I'm not an attorney, maybe Shannon can answer it, but I don't know if he can even answer it for sure, because I don't know if there's a hard and a fast right or wrong on this. But one of the things when you look at kind of the long range planning, if you're sitting there like I sometimes do, and I go, oh, so we got a plan for the growth? Well, that's fine. We'll just say that all of this is going to redevelop to this really great density, but we won't change anything. The state has sort of put out there, what was it, the 3%? Kind of the 3% safe harbor rule.
Yeah, well.
So So there isn't, I don't think an option is to simply, to satisfy the state law, it's not really an option for us to say, hey, no big deal, we'll just get way denser, everything will be fine, don't worry about it, guys. There would actually have to be some sort of demonstrable method that that was actually happening somehow. So by putting, like, for example, we've talked a lot about the revitalization plan, and they did some modeling, which is very high level, kind of, you know, way up here look, not boots on the ground look, but they did some modeling that you could make some arguments that a huge portion of our need could possibly be accommodated with a plan like that, which is a long range plan, and frankly, it wouldn't necessarily change anything immediately. If, you know, it's maybe possible, but you'd have to do a much more in-depth analysis to look at actual housing types that are being produced. And then you'd also really need to look at it over a little bit of time to see are those products actually being built in the marketplace. So that's where it gets a little weird on the growth discussion, frankly, in my mind, because we have to plan for growth, yet we're constrained. And then there's also another piece where we're also supposed to, based on new legislation and legislation that's constantly being shifted and changed, we also need to pay especially close attention to affordable housing concerns, right? And providing housing across the spectrum of all affordabilities. And that's the other piece that we don't do well in Keizer currently, in that when you have a 70%, you know, housing that's slid towards the detached single-family housing, which is basically the more expensive of the housing types, it's very hard to demonstrate you've got enough affordable housing within your boundary to satisfy your population base. So then going back to us being connected to the greater region, it helps with balancing out where the affordable housing lives also. So I feel like the train is completely off the track now, but, yeah, go ahead.
Shane?
Yeah.
Mr. Johnson, you started to raise your hand. Do you have something you want to contribute to this?
No, me, covered it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lawyer?
What is our available acreage right now in Keizer?
For all land types? Let me see if I can find it really quick, Matt.
I tried to search and I couldn't. Because we're not even close to the 479, right?
No. So the 479 is after they actually took all the available land type and ate up. So like the unit count that was needed was a certain amount of units. And actually with the BLIHNA, we assumed a little bit of a shift off of that 69% to some more middle housing and multifamily. So they took that land base and said, okay, you've got this many pieces that could be redeveloped that aren't in the floodplain, that aren't encumbered. And they used some safe harbor numbers that are kind of generally accepted by the state and said, okay, we plug those in and that can cover X amount of units. And what was left over was the 479.
Kyle, did you find the number?
Yeah, it looks like it's 253.
253 acres of
Yeah.
available lands.
Yeah, and that's 167 are partially vacant and 86 are vacant based on their.
So the 470 is above and beyond that 200 available land.
200 sounds kind of optimistic, being able to actually use it
Oh, yeah. the
to
way
its
it's divided.
fullest.
I would say that I have a lot of confidence that that is a valid number, in that when you actually get down on a lot by lot basis, there are a lot of large lots that are available for redevelopment, and that number completely excludes all the numbers that are encumbered with wetlands, with the greenway setback. All of those things have been taken out. I do have confidence that that is a valid number. It's surprising when we keep saying we're out of land, and then you have a report that says, well, you got 200 acres. Well, those are not 200 acres of contiguous greenfield. Oh, there you go.
Someone just forgot to turn right off of the road. Like, oh my gosh, guys.
Exactly.
Here it is.
Did you know?
Exactly. You know.
I'd like to ask what HB 2001 does to all this.
Yeah, yeah,
Because I know you were really excited to tell me what you think is going to happen from that.
Yeah. So that's actually, I think that might lead right into, strategy 2, encouraging a broader mix of
Jeez.
housing types. Yes, Gary, you're welcome.
When you get into that House bill, for
Yeah.
the listeners, would you please maybe give a summary of what that means, or what that House bill is?
Oh, man, that's a tough one. Okay, yeah.
Before we go down that rabbit hole,
Yes.
can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
What I heard you say, Nate, is that based on the information we have now, I've got this concern about the floodplain. I've heard for years, we're still waiting
Yeah.
and anticipating that the floodplain in Keizer is going to be substantially larger than it is now as designated by the federal government. So how can we
plan on those?
be confident in that number if it could be substantially affected?
So the bottom line is the number utilizes the existing floodplain boundaries that are established through the FEMA process. The federal government has been threatening, in fact, really threatening. We got a letter a couple of years ago that was
2016.
2016, 3 years ago.
Yeah.
That was, I've never seen a letter like it, nor since, because they've been backpedaling ever since. But they threatened specifically that we could be held personally liable if there were not the
Yeah, it's Endangered Species Act related.
So basically, this was an outgrowth of court action that said that the Endangered Species Act needs to be compliant with the floodplain management process, and that anything that was contributing had to be included in the floodplain. Well, that blows out the 100-year floodplain, and there's a heck of a lot in Western Oregon. There's a heck of a lot of contribution in the whole habitat species thing. We have been, every year since then, they have given back to us the notice, well, we're still working on the best management practice. Yeah, so it keeps getting extended. The deadline keeps getting pushed back. Now, for better or worse, that is a valid point. And we don't know exactly what that may do to us in the future. I can tell you, though, that the number was derived based on the existing boundaries.
So, if I could, see, my understanding, just one thing that you picked out, just a slight change, Mark, the buyout, whatever it is, the Ventoa, whatever it is. They weren't necessarily looking, a lot of acronyms, they weren't necessarily looking at expanding the floodplain. They were looking at restricting what you could build in the existing floodplain. So, I mean, there's a little bit of both.
There's both.
But
Yeah.
my question is for this study, did they
No.
include any floodplain?
No,
Yes.
the floodplain is excluded. It's considered a land that we don't count as part of our inventory.
Okay. So, I don't know if that's too big a problem then if they excluded it. The only issue would be is if they expand what the floodplain is.
Right. And I think, Mark, the real issue, so when we'll just kind of nerd out a little bit, but when we got the letter in 2016, we went to all these meetings, they had these work groups, and everybody freaked out. The sky was completely falling, and it was a big deal. When legislation changes and when leadership changes that have different priorities, sometimes things slow down. In this case, it's been a pretty obvious example of there's certain things that have slowed down due to political pressures. Our FEMA rep from Region 10, along with, I don't remember which senator it was, but like people went back to Washington and testified before Congress and said, you cannot do this to us in the state of Oregon at this fast of a clip. We need more time to figure out how to respond to this lawsuit that was essentially found FEMA negligent of administering the floodplain in relation to the Endangered Species Act. So the last thing I heard was they got the maximum extension, which was like a 4-year extension. So like 2017, we were supposed to get model code from the state of Oregon, 2018, 2019. Now it sounds like it's gonna be more like 2021, 22 before we get model code. And that's kind of the first step of the biological opinion that said you need to do all of these different steps to bring the program into compliance. Mark, what you're talking about is a really big, huge issue that will be very interesting to see what happens down the road. And that is one of the things identified in the, I don't know what that document was called. It started with an R. It doesn't matter. Anyway, but was that we would look at remapping all floodplains, taking into account things like projected sea level rises and a lot of big things that, depending on what modeling you start looking at, you go, oh, everything's in the floodplain. What? So I think, we're a ways off of that just to see how long it's taken, even right now from 2016 to now, and we're still sitting on it. I think that bottom line is we're going to have to relook at it. And if big changes like that happen, we would be looking at replanning for our 20-year population growth for sure.
All right, Commissioner de Blasio?
In that vein, and you said the W word, that being wetlands, that in the report they mentioned using the NWI, which is notoriously bad.
Inaccurate.
I don't know, I looked at it briefly. Hydric soils is another better filter for where wetlands may be. So I don't know how that would affect these numbers.
Some of this may be a better question for our environmental section, in that what you're talking about would be a city-specific inventory, soil-specific, site-specific inventory. And until there may be a lot of changes coming about a lot of issues. The best way for me to respond to that is, this is a picture with what we know today. And so what we know today and what we have to count on is we have that 200 and some odd acres available to us. If somebody came in today, they could get a permit on those things today. Now, whether the city gets more specific on hydric soils, whether they get more specific about addressing some crazy federal legislation that comes out that says, oh, by the way, everybody has to get flood insurance, which that was a big effect of that potential. We don't know. And so we cannot plan for that at this stage, because we would be definitely wrong. So, and that's a good point to say, no matter what decisions you make, and including in our revitalization, we're looking at a big change. That does not mean that we're not going to have to come back and fix some stuff as we go along this process. So this is what we know today and the best information that we have available today.
To follow up on what Nate just said, and to try to keep us, all this is very good questions and important issues, but to try to move through this, what Shane needs to present to us as a commission, so we can help decide on a path of policies and procedures with the information that we have at hand. Acknowledging that there's some flaws and there's always the opportunity to change based on political wins, if nothing else. So I'd like to kind of keep us moving in that way. Commissioner Lawyer.
I'd like to echo what Jeff said. I think House Bill 2001 has already kind of laid this all out for us for the most part, and we're going to have to comply with what the new statute is going to say. So ultimately, it kind of feels like the next, once we get the Keizer numbers specifically, that's really when the boots are going to hit the ground on this, because the state's already going to mandate that we do all of this stuff anyways.
So somebody asked, what is 2001? Who was that?
Jeff.
Gary wanted a brief explanation for the good of the order.
Okay, good. So briefly, is this last legislative session, the legislature adopted statewide specific performance measures on local jurisdictions and their regulations on housing types, particularly immediately affecting how we do our accessory dwelling units. That will take place as soon as they get the rule written. But in 2 years, there's also significant changes that will be affecting, basically, the catchphrase is single-family zoning is now outlawed. The reality is there will be duplex on all corner lots. There will be specifics on minimum lot sizes and triplexes and quads in residential units, all residential zones.
Yeah, I mean, the bill doesn't totally define how much local regulation will be allowed or not, but it is very clear that DLCD is charged with coming up with a model ordinance for the state for us to look at. But it does, though there is language that says you have to allow duplexes wherever single-family dwellings are allowed.
Right.
And then it has a group and defines middle housing, which does go up to as like townhouses, fourplexes, triplexes, row houses. They talk about cottage clusters. I think one of the things, and this is, and it is the action 2.1, which was to look at those different housing strategies. And they acknowledged, because again, this was published in the end of June. The grant was done at the end of June. They kind of got together with the legislature in July and quickly busted out and passed the bill through. I've been kind of tracking it for quite a bit to see what was going to happen, because League of Oregon Cities testified against it, because it takes away some local controls, and and frankly, everybody's uncertain as to what kind of parameters they're going to put on it. A lot of times when the state passes something land use, they still allow local government the ability to have some local control. And it's still undetermined whether or not we're going to be able to say, okay, yeah, we maybe have to allow a triplex in the RS zone, but does it say it has to be of any lot size, or can it be on a corner? There's some question marks out there that really haven't been vetted yet. What I was kind of looking for specifically as far as policy direction here is that we've identified it as a strategy that the consultant basically said, regardless of the outcome of House Bill 2001, Keizer probably needs to consider some of these types of things and look at how they might be able to implement that. We've kind of looked at this, the revitalization plan started it over a year and a half ago. We were really cutting edge at the beginning, and now it's like, oh, if everybody's gonna have to do this anyway, we're not all that cool anymore. But I do think one of the pieces that there's been a lot of talk, and there's no guarantees, but there's been a lot of talk that there may be some state funds available for communities like ours that show deficits, that need affordable housing, for possibly being early adopters of proposed legislation. So for us, right now, the bill's really clear. By June of 2022, we will have had to update our comp plan and our development code to accommodate whatever this House bill says we're supposed to accommodate. But, that's like 2.5 years out.
The rulemaking process hasn't even begun on that part of it.
Right.
They are working on the quick implementation of the basics on accessory dwelling units. And we know that we're going to be faced with those changes immediately.
Right.
So we tried to, in a nutshell. That's what
Right,
it is.
and the other thing about the strategies document, they kind of laid out some timelines for these different strategies. This is one of the ones that basically the timeline they lay it out is 2019 and 2020. Like, kind of it's a do now kind of thing, that we may want to look at broadening some of the residential uses in this upcoming year. Maybe something we want to put on the work program that we have you guys adopt at each beginning of the year to kind of set the track for Shane and Nate to bring you things. And specifically, one of the things that I would kind of like to hear from your reaction, and like I said, I don't know how much I can have you vote on it, but what is the comfort level if opportunity were to arise for the city of Keizer to be an early adopter and to kind of be a pilot program for allowing these, is that something that this planning commission would feel like would be in our best interest? Or would it be rather a kind of a hold back and let's wait and see how this thing shakes out elsewhere kind of approach? That's, yeah.
Speaking for myself, very favorable.
Okay.
I'm in favor of increasing density in general and would have been even without HB 2001. So
Okay.
to me, it's just greasing the wheels.
Okay.
Speaking for myself.
Sure.
Okay. Yes, Kyle.
So in the meetings, I heard quite a few people that were there talk about not wanting Keizer to change. And so they were not wanting to increase the urban growth boundary. You know, my opinion is almost opposite of that. If Keizer increases density, Keizer will change. So I'm a little bit afraid that if we don't increase the urban growth boundary, we're going to see a significant change in the livability and just the function and feel of Keizer. So I would prefer to work, you know, it's not going to happen right away, but I would prefer living here in Keizer, for Keizer to stay open as it has been for the last, you know, almost 30 years.
Any other comments along that line from the commissioners? Crystal?
Hi. Do we know what the requirements are of HB 2001 other than just get bigger?
No, it's not
Support more needs.
bigger, it's getting
Get
denser.
Yeah.
denser.
support more
It's,
needs.
well, I don't even know. I mean,
Yeah.
it might not be a net density change. It really is allow more housing types everywhere.
Okay.
So, I mean, the House bill's kind of silent on your underlying density. But that will probably shake out in rulemaking because they generally are pretty smart. Because, I mean, if you kept a maximum density of 6 units an acre and said, hey, but you can build multifamily anywhere,
Yeah.
it's still going to be the same number of kind of net units. So I'm pretty sure they'll probably catch that.
Eventually.
But yeah, I think, well, I mean, realistically, that is really the uncertainty of it right now, Crystal, for everybody, is what is going to come out in the rulemaking, how much local control do we get? And I'll use the example because Nate alluded to it. There was a bunch of stuff in House Bill 2001. It wasn't just about allowing middle housing. It also was language about how you do future housing needs analysis. It's how you have to plan for more affordable housing. And it was all driven by kind of an affordable housing need package from a policy perspective. But one of the things that is going to be near and dear to, I think, everybody, is that when we recently amended our accessory dwelling unit standards, and we had all of that conversation about owner-occupied, non-owner-occupied, owner-occupied, non-owner-occupied. Do we require more parking or no parking, more parking or no parking? And it went back and forth, and I think we even had 2 meetings on it because of it. Well, House Bill 2001 just took that away from us and said that a local standard, by definition, cannot be one for parking or owner occupancy when it comes to an ADU. So that actually, I don't know exactly the time frame that goes into effect. I think it's pretty soon. We'll probably be bringing a text amendment within the next few months to do that kind of Scrivener error fix in the development code now. Well, so anyway, but so point being is that they actually weighed in on that and said that is not going to be considered a reasonable local regulation anymore. So.
Okay.
So the best part about, sorry, didn't want to interrupt.
No, I just
Go
had a
ahead.
second question, so go for it.
Well, the best part about it, I was just going to say, is similar to the federal requirements on wetland regulations, all of those kinds of things. We live in a dynamic environment here regarding land use. We are not going to be done. By adopting these housing policies, it just simply sets in motion additional change process. So I guess it's job security. But we're not going to, this document will become outdated very quickly. And so we're going to try and move forward in the best direction that we think possible. And that direction is, if we are going to provide additional housing types, knowing everything that we know now, what do you think about these action items? And do you think, for example, this reducing lot sizes is a reasonable approach to take? That's simply what we're trying to move forward with at this point.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that clarification. I think I was reacting to the idea of being a pilot or being, what do you call it? The
Early adopter.
early adopter. I am a project manager for the government, and I was a business analyst on the Cover Oregon project, which Oregon was called an early adopter of health exchange, and we saw how that went. Shoot. So I guess my question is, being a pilot or an early adopter, does that come with strings? Does that come with timelines? Does that come with a higher set of expectations? Because you're kind of building the road, trailblazing, as opposed to wait to see what happens, and then they kind of concrete what they want.
Sure. So what, we don't know, right? I mean, there isn't really, I don't have a defined answer there, but what has been talked about is there may be grant funds available for a technical assistance grant to essentially write or update development codes to reflect these changes. So essentially, you'd end up with a consultant that would work with you to actually dig into the development code and to create language that would help implement it. So yes, there absolutely would be strings attached. There would be staff time, probably a lot of it. There would be public meetings. There would be all of those things. But what it might come with would be a big piece of heavy lifting, being the bill would be footed by someone else, which might be nice. So, and again, not anything, and even with kind of getting the gauge of what the Planning Commission is interested in, this doesn't talk about this in any way, shape, or form as a strategy document. It just simply says we need to explore and look into these additional housing types with really whatever way we see fit. And if it's, if it's going through possibly a technical assistance grant, if that becomes available, and who knows at the time frame of when that might be, or if it is going in and saying, we think that we might want to allow something a little more, but we do want to put some parameters on it. We have every right to do that right now. That's just a matter of us being innovative and thinking outside of the box however much we want to. Or we can sit back, which is the second action item on this list, like the consultant suggests and says the next one is tiny homes. And I just actually was out at a tiny house symposium in Polk County a few weeks ago and learned a bunch of stuff about the industry that I didn't know about. But that was one of the pieces that some cities have started developing and adopting tiny home standards and allowances. And in here, the consultant kind of says, we think that the city might want to wait a couple years because there's not a ton of good examples out there right now for that. Now, at the symposium, I heard a little different story from the tiny house folks. They said there was lots of good examples. None of them, of course, were in Oregon that they were pointing me to, but lots in Southern California and some back east. But I think that is something that what they were advocating for in a big way was allowing, as an entry point into the tiny house world, for cities to be allowing those as possibly just even as ADUs. And right now we sort of allow them as an ADU, but there's some weird building code issues, and a lot of the tiny houses are on wheels. And if it's on wheels, it effectively isn't allowed because then it's an RV and you can only live in an RV for 30 days. And so there's all these kind of weird nuances that happen. But if that's something that as a planning commission, it was like, oh yeah, we want to look more into the tiny houses, we could absolutely have a conversation about that and how we might be able to create some flexibility in our city for a housing product like that, which essentially they say sometimes those they provide a certain level of affordability because it's a different type of housing product. You're taking my document away? Not one. Okay. So that was kind of a second little piece there, was the tiny house piece.
So, sorry, we've kind of moved on to 1.2, or
Yep, 2.2.
2.2. How did everybody feel about 2.1? I'm not sure I heard. I heard two kind of different opinions.
I didn't hear a clear question.
Okay, let me try to
Well, so I would phrase it this way, Mark. I guess the clear question would be is that, so we've got this document. The advisory committee said, yep, we agree with these things in here. We're kind of asking you guys, do you agree with these things in here, or do you want to make statements that when this were to go to council, that, hey, planning commission doesn't like this particular piece of it, or we do like this particular piece of it? I think that would be what we'd be looking for.
And again, the piece is exploring options for duplexes, different types of housing.
Yeah, encouraging a broader mix of housing types.
Commissioner Kellier? You had your finger up.
Does that include the UGB question?
no.
UGB is
That's later.
1.1.
That's 1.1. We're taking
That's
We're
late.
going backwards. We're dyslexic.
It's the after credits scene.
Hey, this is not my fault, though.
How can I possibly be confused on this?
We're doing the number game again. Numbers and planning obviously isn't a good thing.
Matt, do you have another comment?
So it's interesting, I think, as you consider the early adoption portion of it, especially taking into account what may happen with the River Road revitalization, I think you've already got a mechanism to look at that, especially as it relates to potential funding mechanisms. So if the intent is to move forward with the River Road revitalization as a mechanism to, do some multi-use and look at some options there, that's an easy way to sort of look at that as an easy early opportunity. Part of this is from a very practical aspect. I think I similar to Kyle, have heard from a lot of people that, they want growth opportunities for jobs, not necessarily population. The jobs thing isn't really anticipated, I don't think, much here, right?
No, this is, because of the way that the study was funded, this is specific to housing. It's not an economic analysis, so it doesn't do jobs at all, other than saying where the jobs are currently.
So I mean, I think we're at the threshold of a lot of our infrastructure right now, in terms of roads, and, we got a sewer system that's ancient and all these other things. And so I think that when you continue to sort of stack things on top of that, it just creates some problems. But if there's going to be some funding, especially as it pertains to the River Road revitalization and some of those node areas, that might be a practical way to sort of begin to look at those and sort of do an early implementation of this House Bill 2001 sort of requirements. And so, I think you guys have done a tremendous job of trying to be out in front of what you didn't know was going to be an upcoming trend. And, if we can be on the forefront to capitalize on that in a positive way, I think specifically looking at areas where we know that we have sort of economically distressed areas would be a good place to start, and seeing how some of those might be greater, more creatively impacted, I think, to still allow for that opportunity. It's kind of one of those things. I think looking forward, by 2022, our hands are tied. So we might as well, do what we can to proceed intelligently and cautiously at the same time. So that's just kind of my feeling on it. As far as growth of the city in terms of population numbers, 40,000 is a lot of people for the square footage that we have here in Keizer. So personally, I say give it all to Salem, but that's just me.
Commissioner DeBlasio?
So to the question of, do I like the recommendations as to the housing mix? I like the discussion. There's a lot of discussion about needing all these, a diverse array of housing for affordability, for different life stages, desires. But then at the end, the conclusion is back to, we'll still do most of what we're doing right now. We're still gonna have a lot of single-family housing construction, even in redevelopment. And while the percentage is less than what we have now, it's like when you look at the population of the planet, the birth rate may be going down, but you're still dealing with a big number to begin with. So
Sure.
I think it's still so heavily skewed to single-family detached, which, is what we have right now. To continue down that road and not kind of tweak those numbers more and get more different types of housing, I don't see how we're going to address the affordability or the just the sheer number of units needed.
Right. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Mike. And one thing I would offer is to say that, you know, part of when they come up with the house base and the mix of need is based on a historical reference point. Right. So just looking to the future, the next time a study's done, if a broader mix of housing has been encouraged and allowed for, and then actually constructed, then I think that the argument to be able to say, oh, well, in this planning period, we've actually constructed these townhouses or row houses, or we've all been around the area. I mean, when they first put up and started trying to build condos in downtown Salem that were really expensive, everybody went, oh, that's not gonna happen. And they struggled a little bit for a while, but now it's come back and things are actually, okay, the market's bearing it out. And you can kind of look to that as an indicator for them as they plan for additional future housing mixes. So I absolutely hear where you're coming from on that. And that would be the one thing I would offer just from the planning perspective of doing a housing needs analysis down the road, is if some of those measures have been put into place, it's going to give the city the ability to say, this is what we've built in the last 5 years, and we've seen this housing mix start to move. One of the things that is hard in Keizer is we have a big need for lower income that are severely rent burdened, but we also have a big need for higher income, 120% plus the median income. And that's just based on the demographics of who's living here. And so we have the housing need product of low income houses and also $450,000, $500,000 homes. Like, as far as providing for the folks that are actually here. And so I think a lot of times those demographic numbers and those population numbers, they move very slowly because you have a big base that kind of skews the number one way or the other. But I absolutely hear where you're coming from with that. And I think that is what they're trying to recognize, is that realistically, we're not going to be able to just say, oh, we've got it solved, everything's going to be affordable housing, we'll get it all taken care of. So.
Right, and I understand no one's got a magic wand here, but I guess I want to make sure if we have these goals of affordable housing, more diverse housing stock, and not,
right,
rich people buy condos too.
Right. Well, there's a difference between
places.
Entry-level condos and $1.5 million condos, right?
I agree. But I just want to make sure that we're creating the ecosystem where those places will be desirable, and then will be further built, rather than saying 20 years down the road, gosh, we still need that. And
Sure.
So
I think the big part is this is not one magic bullet that's going to solve the problem. But I think do you want a greater mix of housing types or not? I think you would choose, we want a greater mix of housing, if I'm following your train of thought.
correct.
Mark?
And I just want to reiterate the same thing. I am in support of diverse housing. I believe this community needs it. I believe we need to encourage it. I don't know what tools those that we all have. I think Salem has some more tools than we do to encourage, for example, low-income housing. But the fact of the matter is, it goes back to what Shane just said. It's market-driven. If whoever's building it, if they're going to make some money, they're not doing it to lose money. Right. They're doing it to make some money. And so, and we want to encourage that. So, again, if Portland housing is so expensive that folks are coming to Keizer because they don't mind used to be the 35-minute, now it's the hour and 15, 20-minute commute to Portland, then that's what the market's going to have. And they're not going to want the tiny home. They're going to want a different place. And so Keizer's going to be whatever the market says it's going to be. But we need to do our job and encourage the diversity and use the tools that we have available within the resources that we have. Getting to your question about the grant, I've worked for employers who love grants and get grants just because there's grants available. And I've had them blow up in my face because they didn't have the resources or the ability to do what they thought that we could do, or we said that we thought we could do. but have also had great successes too. So my point being, we should only be looking as being the leading edge, not the bleeding edge, if it makes sense for Keizer and the Keizer staff, which is quite frankly highly limited. And so if, you know, I would leave that discussion for another day. I would encourage it, certainly look at it, but I wouldn't give up anything to do it.
So with those comments being made, does staff have some clarity on what you think we're saying?
I think we have what I perceive as a consensus on the 2.1, develop diversity types. As far as tiny home standards, I'm not sure I heard exactly the same consensus. If I have to extrapolate, I would say it's kind of related to 2.1 in that
Diversity.
Yeah, diversity.
The
just
diversity.
And I
look,
think-
look at the potential. You're not saying wholeheartedly endorsement of tiny homes as the way to solve our
Right.
I
housing.
think like Mark just said, a lot of that is going to be driven by the market.
Okay,
And I think
You know, but if we
specific,
give them that as a tool,
okay.
right.
as an option, and then the market also says yes, because if you're a builder or developer, you don't need to do it for practice, you're doing it to feed your family,
Right.
you know, so we have to make it that way.
Well, there's a little practice.
And the other part of that is tiny houses specifically, they may be to code electrically, they may be to code in plumbing and sewer and such, but they may not be to code in access, and we can make all the rules we want, but if Marion County doesn't pass them, state doesn't allow those kinds of concessions, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah, and that's I think what what I would want, and again, we kind of started this off tonight, and this is like a big part show and tell, and a lesser part action item, because we're not having a public hearing, we don't have an ordinance, we can't actually adopt this thing. So as much as anything with the tiny house stuff, I would want to put that before you for your consideration. And if you want more information on it or you want to explore it, right now in this little strategies document, it was brought up, people talked about it, it didn't really resonate too much, and everybody kind of said, yeah, that's a 5-year plus look. But if that's something that Planning Commission would want to consider on an earlier track than that, then I would say maybe we have some discussion or a little work session, because Mark, you're absolutely right. There's a bunch of different weird standards that come into play. Some tiny homes are regulated as an RV by an AASHTO standard. You got HUD standards for manufactured homes, which are park model RVs. You've got modular construction standards that can meet all regular building code standards, but not all tiny homes can meet those, especially the ones on wheels. And so there are ways that we as a city, I won't say could circumvent the building code, but when building code kicks in is when it's truly a stick-built or modularly constructed home, whereas if it's a tiny home on wheels that's regulated by an AASHTO or a RV standard, they could be built to code and be totally legal, and then it would be the city exercising its zoning authority to say, here's the proper locations for this. Just like the Elks, it has an RV park that was approved by conditional use for a campground. People are living in those year-round there, some people. On Cherry, we've got a couple like that, right? So it's not building code, it's a different code. So again, we don't currently allow that, but if that's something we wanted to look into on a limited scope, we could have those conversations. So as much as anything, I just want you to be aware of that. And then if there's further kind of direction or question we want to push forward, we can open that conversation up. Because right now, based on my marching orders in this document, I'm not even going to look at that until like 4.5 years from now. So, you know, I'm joking, but that is kind of, in a priority scale, it has a much lower priority than the other piece. So if there's a priority that you all would want to see shifted, you just kind of need to let us know that.
Okay, moving on to 3.
Yes.
Yes, so this is identifying strategies to support affordable housing. And one of them would be looking at reduction for parking requirements, something we could do zoning code-wise. The idea behind it from a high level is If you're using up less space for parking, you can use up more space for buildings. So when developers are doing their pro formas and looking at the returns on investment, that could be a factor and ultimately might support some more affordable housing products, because if they're getting more units overall. Anyway, that's kind of one element there, looking at reduction in parking requirements.
Our favorite subject.
It is a rough one, often.
But-
And it is something that we're proposing some reductions in the River Cherry Overlay District. And that was kind of a similar kind of look of, well, this is one of the ways that you can promote some efficiency. Though, and again, the timeline on this is a 2020, 2021 timeline. So we could possibly look at things happening in the River Cherry Overlay District if some things were to be developed in the next couple of years and things were to move forward with adoption, as an example. But yeah, there's not a lot to say on it.
Yeah, so thoughts?
Crystal?
My thought is Keizer is a city of commuters, and we like our cars, so that might hurt a little bit to commute if you don't have a place to park your car.
For example, one of the long-held Keizer things is that we don't allow interior garage space to be counted towards your parking. That may be something that needs to be re-examined. And honestly, we love our cars. I am guilty as can be. But, and quite honestly, I can't park my cars in my garage, and maybe I would need to change.
You can't or you don't?
That's more, the motorcycle does, but
And I think the one thing, from a reduction in parking, generally we will see it in the commercial sector where a lot of times businesses want to build more parking than we even require as a minimum because they know what their market is. And I think home builders tend to be the same. I think they want to build a house that's got a nice product and a decent garage for their clients. So it wouldn't necessarily be mandating reduced parking, but probably more of an allowance of reduced parking, or like Nate said, allowing parking in the garage to count, things like that.
so, we definitely don't want to have the parking debate here now. But parking is one of those things in the toolbox that we could look at. And so really what we're asking you is, are we saying heck no? Are we, trust me, I am right there with you.
Well, and I would say even one of the things they identify in here is the discussion about ADUs and reducing parking for ADUs. And we kind of know in the back of our mind, well, we have to do that. So we'll meet that goal. Like by doing that alone, we are kind of moving toward that goal because the state's mandating us to. So.
Knowing that means there will be parking on the street. Knowing that that's not where we are now. We like Keizer like it is. So I think it's a good way to say, okay, guys, things are changing, and but it's right now we're only talking permissive.
I would say yes, we should look at reducing parking, but I'm cognizant of at the very least that. You mentioned street parking. We already have quite a bit of street parking in residential areas, and that's a big pain point for residents in those areas. If you have to walk a block to your home after you park because you don't know how many cars are there for visitors, or you don't need to know. All you know is that you have to walk to your home. I would hope that part of this would be solutions for those homeowners and ways that we could help give them some local control over how parking happens in their neighborhood. Maybe speak with the neighborhood groups about how they would want us to approach that. Because if we come up with, if we're voting on, you come back to us with A, B, and C proposals for reducing parking requirements, I would just want to know that we have answers before those questions are asked for what that means for those residents who are already stressed out about parking and are just looking at us making pie in the sky projections and saying, don't worry about it, we'll figure it out when we get there. So I assume you would already be doing that, but I just wanted to say it out loud.
Mr. Lark?
So, and please forgive my ignorance, how does parking have to do with the affordability of a house? I mean, other than the fact that you don't count the garage
Well,
Yeah.
for
well,
multifamily?
even small lot development, if you've got to provide two separate, outside of a garage, you have to provide two separate parking spaces, then,
Well,
plus
that's
the-
usually a function of a two-car garage. I mean, if
Well,
you have a
but
single-car garage, a lot of times you only got one spot to park.
we allow tandem parking, so you could have a parking garage, single car parking garage,
That's-
and a single driveway. That requires less space. That's
Yeah.
the bottom line.
It,
Takes less space.
It definitely is eyed more towards the multifamily development, however, for like an affordable housing project. And so that is, and the idea is that parking generally is a pretty expensive piece of a real estate deal for anybody to develop. You know, even surface parking costs a lot to build. So if you can build less parking and build more building, and ultimately have more units on the same amount of space and not cars that are sitting there eating up that space, then that developer can kind of be incentivized by a greater return on the investment. And honestly, the strategy even kind of speaks to the fact that we would need to do some additional modeling to look at what kind of costs and price points would make sense that might actually incentivize that to happen. I think the challenge here for especially affordable housing is, and the document identifies it, and so does the HNA and the BLI, is that there's very limited tools that cities can utilize other than like hard money costs to incentivize affordable housing. One of the ways in a regulatory structure, though, that you could would be with something like reduction in a parking standard.
Michael?
I so want to talk about parking. I do, actually. I'm one of those geeks who talk about it. But you could always come to the Traffic Safety Bike Ped Committee meeting on Thursday tomorrow, and we could talk about it too. Or read Daniel Shoup's The High Cost of Free Parking. I brought this up before. I can't remember how long ago, but I've heard before, you know, if you want to build a mixed use, truly mixed use, where you've got commercial on the first floor, residential above, you're dealing with different funding streams, different lending. Is there anything the city can do to grease the skids on those things?
I think part of the plan is look at funding. That's one of the action items, is to look at how you can provide these incentives or funding sources or differences. The problem that we have in Keizer is we are very limited. We were incorporated with the lowest full-service city rate in the state. But that doesn't mean that there isn't ways that we can do it. We could restructure our transportation SDCs. We could create an urban renewal district, and we'll go through that very quickly. And I think, honestly, when we get to that, I think it's, the action item is to explore funding sources. And I think it's pretty safe to say that we're all going to say, duh, we have to. Affordable housing isn't just something that, Kyle, you as a builder are going to go out and build an affordable housing. You have material costs, you have labor costs, you have land costs, you have the cost of hooking to the system, all of those things. You don't just come up with these prices on your own. They all add up to be expensive housing. And so even though we do small lot, even though we do townhome, even though we do multifamily, that is not affordable housing. And so it's not until we find these other solutions. So the bottom line is, I think we want to, As far as parking goes, I think I heard loud and clear, and I see if we can get this as consensus. I think, Jeff, when you said, it's not just, well, let's just eliminate parking requirements and we're all happy and things are going. I heard loud and clear that you have to look at how you're going to address it as a comprehensive picture, whether that requires additional regulations or districts or whatever. I think what I heard you say and what I'm taking away from what you said is you have to look at it more comprehensively than just, well, let's reduce parking requirements.
Yeah, you're correct. Because reducing parking in one area means you're increasing parking in another. I think philosophically, we've probably got a lot more of this solved than we think we do, provided we move forward with the adoption of the river road revitalization. All the greenways, all the additional bike paths, the easier it is to get around without a car, the more people without cars will be part of that 40,000 population increase, and the less spaces we'll need. So it's aligned, and we can acknowledge that, but a lot of folks that already live here are already stressed. And I don't want to leave them out while we're looking at the 40,000 that are on their way.
Is that a consensus? Does that pretty much articulate the feeling of the commission?
Yes.
Okay.
3.2,
Wait a
preserve, oh,
We might have a last-minute revision.
No,
Okay.
I just had
An
one more
addition.
question about the lending. Can the city put requirements on lending, or is that a state level thing? That's like state has, yeah, okay.
Yeah, the attorney says we can't regulate it.
Okay.
I wasn't exactly sure what your question was, but yeah, that is something way beyond our wheelhouse. We don't control those funding sources. We don't have access to those funding sources. So I think the answer is no.
okay, so action 3.2 is to preserve existing supply of manufactured housing parks. And the idea behind this is that manufactured home parks often provide a natural form of affordable housing, even if they're not subsidized or regulated or restricted. And so there isn't a lot of definition as to how this would necessarily be looked at. In fact, they kind of put a pin in it because the revitalization plan was going on with along the same track. And so the implementation timeframe is kind of wait until the revitalization plan has kind of got through its public process to determine how the city wants to move forward. We have heard public testimony at some of our meetings about concerns on redevelopment and what that might do to manufactured home parks. So it's one that basically it's a action item that's kind of hanging out there, but as much as anything to be an identifier for all of us to recognize that if we want to truly protect and preserve affordable housing, one method that we might be able to do that in would be through additional local regulation to require things like replacement of affordable units or with manufactured home parks specifically, there's a bunch of state laws around it. If one got shut down or people got moved out, there are some requirements on the property owners, but it may be that we as a city want to consider some additional requirements on top of that. So that's what this 3.2 speaks to.
Yes?
I know, right?
And in fact, we can kind of just move through it unless it's something like, wait, this is a major issue.
Mark?
Yeah, it's not a major issue, it's just that, like all housing forms, they have a life. And a lot of the mobile home structures that we have in Keizer are coming to their end of their useful life. So instead of having the 10-foot wide, 40-foot long mobile home, now it's a 24-foot wide, 60-foot long, somewhat modular home that is, so trying to figure out how to work with encouraging and helping that turnover when we have the opportunity. within the restrictions that we have. I mean, I realize it's kind of hard to put a 24 by 60 in the same spot you have a 10 by 40. But, you know, but maybe there's setback issues or whatever the case may be. They've got to be safe and all those kinds of things, but.
Get rid of the parking.
Get rid of the parking.
We looked at that.
But these are, you know, and remember, it's all private property. I mean, you know, we can't, there's only so much that we can do, but we can work with that industry to help with the rotation of the stock.
This is one of the reasons why the revitalization plan actually suggests that we look at rezoning the manufactured home park at the corner of Lock Haven and River. That's on the list, but that's not on our implementation because this is going to take a lot of careful examination as to how this might happen and how it would get implemented. It's not going to happen because of the existing legislation, the existing statutory requirements. It would have to be a careful process. And we're not prepared to do that anywhere within the scope of these projects. Okay, I think that was, I think Jeff said it correctly. Yes.
Okay.
You know,
Okay, yeah, okay, so we're to strategy 4, guys, we're close. We're almost to the big question to be discussed. So strategy 4, evaluate funding tools. So the first one is evaluate creative system development charge financing opportunities. The ideas thrown out there are maybe SDC waivers or reductions if somebody were coming in and developing a certain housing type that you wanted to see. I think an example right now that's happening in Salem is waiving SDCs for ADUs right now. I don't know how long they're doing that, but they've made kind of a specific decision from a policy perspective that says we want to incentivize some additional accessory dwelling units being built in our city. So we're not going to charge any SDC charges for these as they come in.
just transportation.
Yeah, I think it's just transportation because they're just like us. They're sharing water and sewer, I think, on them. So those are the types of things in this one. The other thing it talks about is not just reducing, but implementing finance credit program, basically creatively financing some of the SDCs. I think it's a good one on the list, and I'll kind of overstep my bounds here and just say that I think most people who've built in Keizer and developed in Keizer would go, SDCs isn't a boundary for us in Keizer. Our fees are pretty reasonable compared to the market. And so I don't think this one probably needs to get too carried away with one way or the other, but I think it's a good thing to keep on the list in the toolbox of possibilities for things to look at, especially if you're looking at a certain housing product you're wanting to see developed in an area or something.
Just so you know, just by saying, well, like we think we should waive SDCs for ADUs, our methodology would have to be rewritten for transportation system development charges. So nothing is easy, just so you know, but it's a methodology, it's a tool that we could use to address it. So I think, Jeff, you want to say it?
Yes.
Okay.
Mike?
But
Okay, fine.
I would say having the SDC charges kind of on a sliding scale, so the maybe 0 when you're in a transportation corridor you're trying to get people to really dense and moving around, walking around, to further out you get, the higher it gets.
Sure. And that I think that's why I would say, absolutely, that is a possibility to do, but we would have to do the process to restructure our current system and methodology.
When you do that, given that the cost per foot of water line or curb and sidewalk and roadway doesn't change just because it's on a scale,
Yeah. nor does the cost of building an intersection.
Right. So what we have to be aware of is what that does to the budget of those departments as well. Because we don't want to compromise the infrastructure that we have by discounting growth around it.
Well, the simple
So
way
how do
to,
we have to make sure that we balance that?
the simple way to look at it, if you reduce SDCs on one category, you're increasing them on another category. Just
Right. But as long as, I just want everybody to be cognizant of that fact. I think this committee is, but we need to say that out loud.
yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Gary. And the other thing to point out on this one is that this was identified as one of those issues that's not a real high priority on an action item. It's a 3+ year kind of look. And it says, from the consultant, they're like, the other thing is before you go and decide to bust out and do something like this, probably needs to have some sort of an ad hoc committee that's got some governance by council to really look at those fiscal impacts that you're talking about. Exactly. So,
Mark?
So how does redevelopment affect SDCs? You've got a commercial building, and somebody comes along and says, hey, we want to do a multi-level, commercial, mixed use. That building's been there for a long time, it's been paying its taxes, it's been paying all the, SDC or whatever when it first started, if they had them back then. But it's been supporting the system. Now you're taking that down and putting a whole new, denser
right.
development. SDCs start anew?
No.
Generally, they'll get, from the simplest perspective, Mark, generally they would get a credit for what is there.
Okay, so credit for time served and perspective.
And what they use, use square footage, certain SDCs, transportation is the easiest, it's by a trip count. So you'd look and say if it was this building that was generating a certain number of trips, they're gonna get a credit. But if they build something that's putting a ton more trips onto River Road or wherever, they're gonna pay the SDC difference of that.
Gotcha. Okay, so they do, in a sense, get a reduction because they get credit for what was there. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so 4.2 is evaluate the creation of an urban renewal district. And this is specifically in relation to, it could be for some infrastructure and public projects to serve the residential development, but also with a bent looking towards how you might be able to utilize urban renewal funds to invest back in an area for kind of government subsidized affordable housing project and using those urban renewal dollars to leverage that through a grant program or something like that with a private developer. Again, not a high priority at this time. We don't have an urban renewal district currently. Looking at, again, the 3-year plus kind of window down the road. So not an immediate move, but something to keep in the back of the mind for consideration.
I think it's a tool that we should have as an option to utilize.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Exclamation point.
Okay.
Michael?
So for these kind of funds, how restricted are they in what uses they can be?
It would simply depend on how you establish the urban renewal district. So you go through a process, kind of like SDCs. You go through a process of you have to create what your indebtedness is going to be based on a specific purpose and projection.
Any other questions on that? Next.
Okay, the next one is evaluate imposing a construction excise tax. That's hard for me to say right now. It would basically be another fee that would be collected and earmarked for certain city-funded projects for the affordable housing piece of things. And that one, they kind of put a timeline of that of 2020 to look at that. Yeah, I think it's something that we would, ultimately, you would need to run some modeling and some numbers, because the big thing is that the state has some rules about how much you can collect anyway. And you'd have to look and say, okay, what kind of permit history are we pulling? What kind of projects are we doing? I mean, is it going to be worth bringing, is it going to bring in enough money to actually be worthwhile? So, yes, ma'am.
So it's 1% generally on the excise tax, is that right?
That's my understanding, yes.
So that is non-affordable housing types pay that 1% to go towards subsidizing affordable housing.
Yeah, I mean, from a really like simplistic smart alecky kind of thing, it reminds me of like carbon offsets, right? I mean, right. I mean, like that's kind of what it seems like. That's
He did not say that.
So,
Really.
well, and I guess I want to, and I apologize for doing this, but I heard the sliding scale thing on the SEC, right? Where we go nothing for affordable housing, but then we're charging the people up here a whole bunch of money to pay for the infrastructure that's in the affordable housing. That to me is kind of problematic. You know, I think you're disincentivizing that a different group of people that are wanting to live in Keizer. Yeah, I don't. That concept is problematic to me.
okay.
I do wonder what kind of a welcome mat it is, along with the River Road revitalization, changes to code, changes to setbacks. Like, hey, welcome to Keizer. Here's some new rules. Also, here's a new tax.
Right.
Thanks for choosing us.
Right.
Not that is. I mean, we need affordable housing. We need some way to pay for it. I just don't know what the 1-2 punch looks like.
Well, you got to pay for it without displacing the people you're trying to
Yeah.
take care of.
I guess that's the sort of thing that we would look at, though, if we were looking at it.
Counselor
Just how to
Frings.
manage that.
So I'm just going to share a little bit on construction excise tax. For the record, I work for Oregon Housing. I happen to be the homeownership section manager, and my department benefits greatly from construction excise tax.
But do the citizens?
Well, actually, it comes into my section. It will go out in a competitive process. And right now, we have, in the city of Portland right now, has collected over $2 million that will go back to nonprofit partners within the city of Portland to administer for down payment money. So they can, a homeowner who is below 100% AMI could receive up to $15,000 for down payment. I get both sides of it, I truly do. I just see it coming in and hopefully the benefit of going back out. So the jurisdiction that collects it, it goes back to the jurisdiction to be utilized in that community. So whatever funds Keizer collected, if that was an option, it would come back to people buying homes in Keizer. So it stays within the jurisdiction that collects it.
Kim, and I didn't mean to have that as flippant as it probably sounded.
Oh, no, you're
But
fine.
my question was more like, okay, you have an agency in place, and there's a cost of your agency to do that. So of the, say, 2 million that's going back to Portland, how much do you have to collect to give them that 2 million?
Well, I can tell you that the state receives no administrative funds for this program. The jurisdiction that collects the CET money is allowed to take an admin fee, but the state is not. So this is a program that we fund through my department, but there is no admin money associated with it.
And do you know, in the case of where the jurisdiction that, in this case, Portland, are they capped at what they can take?
Yes. I'm not going to quote
Oh,
an
no,
amount, but
that's fine,
they do
but I
have an
just wanted to
amount,
make
and
sure
they
that
get to
there's
take
some-
that off the top before they ever remit any money to our
Okay.
agency.
I just wanted to make sure that there's some sort of a cap or checks and balances that the majority of the funds that are paid by others actually get to the end user
Correct.
at a high rate. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes,
The housing strategy on page 17 said the city can retain 4% of the funds to cover administrative costs.
okay, thank you, Shannon. 4%, that's not bad.
Well,
I mean, it's
Not a
not
whole lot.
great,
that's 4% of the funds collected.
right.
A 1% permit valuation.
Yeah, of 1% of the permit valuation.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I think you'd have to do some math to see how it would work, where you have Portland doing massive projects
Right.
that are worth millions
Right.
and millions
Yeah.
of dollars. 1% permit fee is not a huge amount. So it would take some to add up. But it's, again, a tool that could be utilized to be looked at and considered.
What's the thoughts of the commission? Just, Mr. Callier.
Well, I'm not really familiar with the construction excise tax, but my first thought was, gee, we have this SDCs that were relatively low, and realizing that they probably can't be used, you can't have an SDC for affordable housing perhaps, but you have construction, and it's not just on new homes. This construction excise tax, I believe, is like any permitted remodel or anything else, so it's not just new builders. SDCs are new development. This is on everything.
The home
So,
project, I want to put an addition on my shop,
yeah,
and it's $5,000 permit. There could be an excise tax.
yeah,
on that.
electrical, plumbing, whatever, remodel, whatever. It's a 1% that you're not paying now.
Other comments?
I think even at that level, though, I mean, you get to the point where, as you mentioned, Shane, I think the money that would come in would not even necessarily probably be enough from the 4% to pay for you guys, which are already stretched as thin as possible. So, I mean, we're already dealing with staffing issues at a larger level in terms of the city, and just adding one additional program and one additional thing that you guys have to govern, I think is, we're stretched thin with staff, big time.
Oops. I appreciate that thought, I really do. The reality is, though, it depends on how it is, what the administration requirement is. If it's just simply a matter of pushing the button on your permit and there's a 1%, right now, the state surcharge on a building permit is, how much, Kyle? 8%? 8%. I mean, so we administer that, but it's just a matter of, this is what your permit fees are and this is what we collect.
But in terms of reciprocating that, those dollars back out, I think is, and then doing
Well,
that
but
piece.
if we just simply turn it over to Counselor Freeman,
But it still goes back to, from what I heard, it still goes back to the jurisdiction to get those funds out.
That's
my point.
And Matt, you're right. I think that would be part of the analysis would have to be, okay, we maybe could project to collect this kind of funding stream. Now, what would be the best bang for the buck to reinvest that in the area? How would you do that? Would it be through a grant program? Would it be through whatever it might be, low-income homeowner, buyer help or whatever? But that would definitely be something that would have to be looked at. And they clearly did not, the consultant did not look at that in detail, just gave some options for us to consider.
Michael?
Council.
Oh, I just want to clarify, it comes back to the city, not to the city to administer. So it would be a nonprofit who would be
okay.
administering those grant funds.
Right.
So it doesn't come, but it would come back to a resident who wants to buy a home in the city of Keizer. So,
Good clarification.
okay, thank you. If I wasn't clear, I apologize.
No, you said that,
No, it's good.
short-term memory issue still. So.
No, it's fine.
Michael? Oh, okay. 4 what was that, 4.1?
one, no.
That's 4.3,
That
man.
was
We're close. We only got
4.3.
two more.
We're moving, okay. So do we want to keep that there? Do we want to scratch it?
Subject to further study. I would put that caveat. I've heard your comments, and I think depending on how we administer it, how it would roll out, how much we would actually be administering, and those kinds of things. If I heard your comments correctly, if I had to summarize your consensus, it's a tool that we should look at and be careful of how it's rolled out.
Jeffrey?
I would say, yes, that's for me as well. But on a larger scale, I'm disinclined to say anything against looking at a tool and evaluating whether we should use it. So I have a hard time imagining any of these topics that I looked, and I've scanned the document and just what we've talked about, where I'd say, non-starter, absolutely not. Because they're all reasonable to a degree, and with further information, we could find out what that degree is. I guess my question for staff would be, how will you determine the priority level for each of these? In what order are you going to evaluate and begin evaluating and put resources into over the next year and a half to present these to us? That would be my bigger question, rather than should we look at it at all?
Well, I've been making some notes from you guys' comments and knee-jerk reactions, so truthfully, in my mind, I already have kind of a priority scale.
Okay.
No,
Easy to hold.
honestly, Jeffrey, that is frankly one of the reasons we wanted to have the show and tell time with you guys.
So based on interest and...
To try to kind of figure out what are the pieces that make total sense to everybody, what are the pieces that are, let's hold off and think some more. So, I mean, really, that's kind of what we're looking for.
Okay.
And keep in mind, we are taking this same show to council. And council is the one that actually sets policy. And so they will be the ones basically saying, there's a suggested priority here in the report. And it's going to be council that says, you need to do this one, and you need to maybe look at that one a little later, and here's your priorities. That's really the bottom line.
Sure, okay.
So while we're talking about time and council and so on and so forth, and I glance up at the clock, and we have one item that I think is going to take a significant amount of discussion that we haven't even approached yet. So with the consent or the ideas of the council commission, do we want to finish up 4? And then maybe bring 1 back for next month? What's the urgency to get this to council?
Well, unlike everything else that we do, this one really, this one does not have, there is no burning fuse. This is, we have the report. We've got work to do before we do anything with it. So we can't adopt it. So that would be completely possible. And maybe we could set the mindset of what we're looking at when we talk about the big question so that people can be considering that. I think it'd be perfectly doable to come back. We don't have anything, we don't have the notice because of everything else we're doing. We don't have anything noticed for the next meeting. So it would be entirely possible to come back next meeting to talk about the big one.
How's the commission feel about that? Rather than, you know, to give these questions the respect I think they deserve and for us to make informed recommendations, would you rather kind of cut it off at the end of sort of where we are and save the rest of it for beginning next month?
Seems reasonable to me.
Michael, I know that you're going up the commission, as is Kyle.
So we'd be talking over there.
That's where I gave my opinion already.
I can give my opinion.
Well, actually, maybe, you know, if that's because we are having 2 new commissioners come on next month, and we're losing 2 very valuable members, and I don't want to have them walk away feeling like, well, we didn't get to be part of this decision. So maybe, and Kyle, I think you did summarize very succinctly what you had to say, and I appreciate
gave
that.
mine because I knew I may not get a chance.
Okay. And Michael, if you would do that, I think it would help the commission.
So the
know
other
what we're
option,
going to
if I might just throw out there, even though they're not sitting there, they can
Right.
certainly sit there.
Yeah.
And because this is all advisory anyway, none of this is binding. You're not taking a binding decision. So I don't view that as a big problem unless you've already got something committed. Maybe, I don't know, I'm off.
Yeah, well, I mean, my opinions on any UGB expansions are, what is the return on investment? You know, yeah, we open up land for development, and at that time of development, now the tax base is increased on that land, but 25 years down the road, are we gonna get the return on investment? So that's always my thought.
Well, that's absolutely. And I would hope this is not going to be the last that we see of both of you.
Yeah. But you have to come to my meetings on Thursday.
He's already threatened me to not show up.
Categorically.
Okay. So it's up to you.
So do we want to continue this for next month? Or do we want to continue tonight? We want to stay here and work on this for ever?
Not that he has any feelings
Commissioner,
about
whatever
it.
you want to do, just typically.
Okay, then I
cover
would
that.
I would recommend that we stop at this point. You have-
Can we finish 4?
Yeah, how
Because
much?
I think we can finish it really quick.
Okay, yeah,
There's
that's-
2
I
of
meant to
them,
finish 4
and if
and
you
then
just
go on.
let me, I think I have a way that we'll just say yes. So 4.4 talks about evaluating the implementation of a local improvement district, and that is only recommended if a UGB amendment were pursued, because it would encumber that new property being brought in to help fund infrastructure, okay? That seems like a no-brainer to me, and it's very contingent upon the other big question that's gonna be talked about next month. The 4.5 is even more of a non-issue, and then it says, consider partnerships to pursue grants or loans. So again, very opportunistic in nature, and looking at ways that we might be able to leverage free resources or little resource for free money seems like a good idea, and we already do that on a very regular basis. So,
Yes.
Yes.
So I live in the world of grants, and there's no such thing as free. There's always strings attached. There's always specific expectations, and so I would say proceed with caution as you go into those and be mindful of what those strings are. You don't want to enter into a grant that creates an unintended mandate.
sure.
And so I think we have to be mindful of that, but certainly looking at them and looking at loan opportunities is an absolutely good idea.
Okay.
Michael?
This is beyond just a grant, this is more of a suggestion. I think I brought this up too before. Some cities in this, not in the state, because it's not legal in the state, but in the country, allow for taxing, where you tax the land at a certain rate high in the urban area, and then improvements only marginally increase the tax rate. So, you know, when you're at your League City meetings or your whatever parties you have with other cities, talking to them about trying to lobby the legislature for something like that, to allow the cities in Oregon to do that.
Yes. Making sense of Oregon's taxation system is a good thing to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so, we're good, Shane?
That was it. 4's done. The only
Okay.
thing we have left is like 1.1.
So,
You'll thank me later.
Matt,
Oh, sorry. Go
Oh.
ahead.
let's move on to new old business.
Well, can I, sorry, I didn't know if you were gonna, I think the only thing, you know, I think these are all really good allowances. I agree with Jeff on evaluating a lot of those things. I think allowances are very important. I struggle with the concept of mandates because I think that creates unintended consequences in the wrong area when you start to mandate how a city will look or will not look or what have you. And you look at them 30, 40 years later, they're a shell or a ghost of what they were intended to be. And so I just think we need to be mindful of that and mindful of what the people in this entire process have said that they want from their city. And I would expect that as any of this conversation continues to go on, we'd be mindful of the citizens of the city and hear their voices and encourage as much public participation as humanly possible to help this process. It's a huge lift. A lot of people participated in these studies, and I would just hope and encourage that we keep goal 1 in the forefront of our thinking as we proceed in any evaluation of any of these options. I think they're all good. You guys, I mean, handling 2 gigantic grants. We haven't closed it. We're not done. We haven't talked about 1.1, but this is a huge heavy lift on both of you doing this and the other study and the transportation study, and I'm sure probably 30 others you're working on. So I just want to say thanks. I mean, you guys, I think in terms of, from my personal lens, looking at these 3 options really before us tonight in terms of 2 through 4, did a great job, and thanks for having a very succinct first introduction to this minus 1.1. So that's all I just want to say.
Okay.
New old business.
Staff report?
Yeah. Well, a brief staff report is that on Monday, you've heard it talked, and now it's to the council for their hearing and adoption of the Keizer revitalization. I have basically, I would ask you to go online and look at the staff report, be familiar with how it's characterizing that study. Some of the discussion that you had is being folded into it. Particularly, I'm talking about the concern about mid-block crossings and pedestrian safety. What we are asking the council if they want to include that they would basically direct, as part of the approval process, they would direct the inclusion of a commitment or a process to specifically identify pedestrian safety through a study and evaluation. There was some debate about whether you wanted to include that in your motion or not, but the discussion is being had. I will be going to the traffic safety, bikeways, ped, safe, whatever the term is. You get the idea. Tomorrow to talk about it and to basically I'm going to share with them how that is. The problem is there's a suggestion that we incorporate specific locations, that there is this location that needs to be included in the plan. And that is incongruous with the plan in that just as we would not include a specific intersection in the comp plan, we simply say pedestrian safety is of utmost importance and needs to be addressed. And then we go from there. I'm summarizing it. So yes, that staff report went out today. Kim hates me today because it's a big, big thing. I'm sorry. Anyway, that's on Monday, and we are confident that the year-and-a-half process that we've gone through is robust and has gotten, for these kinds of projects, has gotten good public participation. So enough of that. The other thing I wanted to share with you, and Matt mentioned it, is we now have our intergovernmental agreement with ODOT to spend money for our cost of impacts of growth on the transportation system. And that basically is looking at 3 different scenarios as to what happens to our transportation system specifically through 3 different growth scenarios. If we expand our urban growth boundary, then what do we need to be prepared to address? And what kind of transportation improvements do we need to make, not just within our city limits, but up to Brook Lake and appropriate intersections? Everything to, if we infill to the best that we can and send everything else to the rest of the growth boundary, what does that do to our transportation system? And then a third option somewhere in between. Anyway, we have the IGA. We are preparing a request for proposal, and that will be going out in the very near future. We want to move as quickly as possible because, as you know, this is very germane to these other big issues. So that's my staff report.
Okay. Council Liason report. Council President Freeman.
I don't have much other than I would like to invite everyone tomorrow night at 7. So after you're done with traffic bikeways, come to the West Keizer Neighborhood Association meeting here at 7. Carol Dorfler is our president. So, and that is just a reminder that all the neighborhood association meetings have resumed for the month of September. You know, we always take a break during the summer. The first Thursday of the month is Southeast Keizer, and then second is us, West Keizer, and then the third Thursday is Gubser at 7 still, right?
Yeah, but I'm not sure where it is because I'm not going to be at the school. It can't be here.
It's going to be a week late.
That's right, they postponed it a
Okay,
week.
thank you for that.
Just this month.
Yeah, just this month.
But Debbie, do you know where they're meeting on a, oh, here, okay, great. So, yeah.
Is that permanent or just for that time?
Yeah, so, just attend those if you can. They are a wealth of information, and I believe tomorrow night, Nate is our guest speaker.
One
Of the guest speakers, okay?
Carol graciously carved out some time.
So if you've not heard Nate enough, just come back to, come to
right.
Traffic Bikeways and then come to West
put it
Keizer.
that way, I'm sure there'll
And
be a
then
lot
come
of
back on
takers.
Monday night for the council meeting, because I think we'll have some great discussion. So I just want to thank the committee for your work last month and this month. And I usually say when I give my report, the great work this committee does along with others, because it's a lot of work and a lot of reading, and I guess that's what I'm doing this weekend too. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Debbie?
I just wanted everybody to know that the digital message board is up and running. So today, there was an announcement saying this meeting was tonight. Yesterday, there was one saying this meeting was tomorrow. So, and I'll be doing that with all the meetings, including the neighborhood associations.
Nice. Good, thank you.
That's right. And look at the draw.
Look at the draw.
Okay. One thing we have, I mentioned it earlier, that this is the last meeting for Commissioner Kyle Duran and Commissioner Michael de Blasi, who have both spent 6 years with us. And I think Mark has a comment or two that he was going to make.
Okay, then.
And then Michael had something, and Kyle, if you want to say anything, you're more than welcome to.
Well,
Thank you, Mark.
I just wanted to thank you both for your service. 6 years, first of all, is 2 years longer than a stint on city council, and I can tell you what that was like. So your dedication is to be admired. Kyle, you're very quiet, but when you have something to say, I really appreciate your insight, particularly from the standpoint of your business and your career. It's important to have somebody in the building industry on this commission, because we just don't know what we don't know sometimes. And Mike, I have really grown to appreciate also that your fortitude in wanting to do what's right for Keizer and particularly for pedestrian traffic and non-motor vehicle traffic. We have a lot of issues along that line just in our infrastructure. If you've ever tried to ride a bicycle down River Road on the street, it's literally impossible to do. And is that really what we want in our community? Granted, we don't see hundreds of bicycles, but there may be a reason for that because they're not riding on River Road. So you're going to be missed. And both of you, your different perspectives, the diversity of your perspectives is what makes this committee work well and makes Keizer strong, and appreciate all your efforts.
Michael?
Well, 6 years, I had lost track of the years. I had hair, actually, when I started. But it has been a pleasure. Certainly, there's a lot of newer faces now than when we first started. But it's good to see new faces, too, and the next generation of Keizerites being represented. So I really appreciate that. I think my overarching philosophy has always been, and I mentioned it a little bit tonight, is the financial stability and success of Keizer. So looking at everything through that lens, but also having a good quality of life for the people in Keizer. And that means for all people's different types of desires and types of lifestyle. So it's been a pleasure, and unfortunately I still get to be a pain in the neck for the city on the traffic safety bike ped committee. So you still have me to kick around. But I appreciate it, and I wish you all who are still on the best of luck.
Thank you. Thank you. Kyle, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, being here 6 years, it has seemed like it's gone by quicker than I expected. I didn't realize it was 6 years until they told me I had to leave. I'll probably be around. I'm on the board of directors for the Home Builders Association, and I imagine I'll be, here for anything that has to do with any building. And I'm on the board of directors for the Chamber of Commerce, so I imagine I'll get elected to show up for things for that also. So you won't get rid of me completely, but I've enjoyed my time here. And, I enjoy living in Keizer, and I enjoy working in Keizer. And, that's really my driving factor of, why I've been here and what my, role has been, as owning a business here in Keizer and living here. I really wanted to see what's the best for everybody, and that's been my goal. So I appreciate the fact that I've gotten to be here so long.
So, thank you, gentlemen, both very much. And with that, I move we adjourn. See everybody next.